My name is Arthur Whitmore. I am 86 years old. For most of my life, I built something people admired. A career that filled rooms. X, a name that opened doors. A life that, from the outside, looked complete. And for a long time, I believed it was. Until one morning, I realized something I couldn't ignore anymore. I couldn't breathe inside it. It happened on a Tuesday. The meeting room sat at the top of a glass tower, high enough that the city below looked distant, almost unreal. 12 people were seated around the table. Some of them had worked with me for decades. Others had spent years trying to earn a seat in that room. In the center of the table was a deal large enough to outlive all of us. They were waiting for me. Someone was speaking. Numbers, projections, careful optimism. I had heard versions of it my entire life. I looked around the room, at the faces, at the polished surface of the table, at the reflection of a man who had spent more than 60 years becoming someone others respected. And for the first time, none of it felt like mine. The voices continued, but they seemed to move past me, as if I were no longer part of the room I had once defined. Then something small caught my attention. My hand resting on the table, still, heavy, older than I remembered it. And I realized how many years I had spent sitting in rooms just like this, always reaching, always deciding, always moving forward, without ever stopping long enough to ask why. "Arthur?" The man across from me said my name again. I heard him. I just didn't respond. Because in that moment, something inside me had already gone quiet. Not the kind of silence you find in a room, but the kind that appears when you finally stop pretending you still want what's in front of you. There was nothing left in that room that I needed to hold on to. Not the deal, not the recognition, not even the version of myself that had built it all. So I stood up, slowly enough that the chair barely made a sound. A few people glanced in my direction. Most didn't. They assumed I would step out and return in a moment. After all, I had done that before. But this time was different. I walked to the end of the table, past the glass wall where the city kept moving, as if nothing had changed. For a second, I saw my reflection. A man who had spent a lifetime becoming someone the world could recognize. And then I kept walking. Out of the room, into the hallway, toward an exit I had passed through thousands of times without ever really seeing it. I didn't go back that day, not to finish the meeting, not to explain myself, but I didn't disappear either. In the weeks that followed, there were conversations, papers to sign, responsibilities to transfer. There are always details when you leave a life behind. People would later say I had lost my mind, that no one walks away from that kind of success at 86. Maybe they were right, or maybe it was the first decision I had made in decades that actually belonged to me, because for the first time in my life, as I stepped outside that building and felt the air without glass between us, I could finally breathe again. The next morning, I woke up at the same time I always had, 6:30. For a moment, my body moved before my thoughts did, reaching for a routine that had shaped my life for decades. But there was nowhere I needed to be, no meeting waiting, no decisions stacked on top of each other, no quiet pressure building before the day had even begun. I sat at the edge of the bed and listened, not to anything in particular, just the absence of noise. It felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. By mid-morning, my phone had already filled with messages, assistants, colleagues, people who had built their schedules around mine. At first, I didn't answer. Not because I didn't care, but because I realized how much of my life had been spent reacting, responding, maintaining. I needed, for once, to choose my next move without being pulled into it. But walking away doesn't mean disappearing. By the end of that week, I began returning calls, not to resume anything, but to close it properly. There were meetings, different from the ones before, quieter, more direct. No negotiations, no strategy, just transition. Lawyers were involved? Of course they were. There are always papers when a life like mine changes direction. Documents that carry decades of decisions. Signatures that slowly untangled me from everything I had built. I didn't give everything away. That wouldn't have made sense. Instead, I transferred control, responsibilities, authority, the weight of decisions that no longer belonged to me. Some people didn't understand. A few thought I was making a mistake. Others were more direct. They asked if I was tired, if something was wrong, if I had lost the clarity that had defined me for so long. Maybe I had, or maybe, for the first time, I was no longer trying to be clear for everyone else. My family reacted differently, not with anger, but with concern. They had spent their lives watching me build something that felt permanent, and now they were watching me step away from it. So I told them the only thing that felt true. I wasn't leaving them. I wasn't abandoning anything that mattered. I had already given them everything they would ever need, just not the expectations I had carried for myself all those years. The house grew quieter as the days passed. Rooms that once held conversations, plans, movement, now held stillness. One afternoon, I walked through it slowly, past the office, where decisions had been made late into the night, past the dining room where I had sat physically present, but mentally somewhere else, past the windows that framed a life most people would have envied. And for the first time, I didn't feel proud. I didn't feel regret either. Just distance. I realized then this place had been built for a version of me that no longer existed. So I began letting it go. Not all at once, but deliberately. One decision at a time. By the end of the month, there was very little left tying me to that life. Not because it had disappeared, but because I had finally stopped holding on to it. What surprised me most wasn't the silence. It was what came after. Space. Not the kind you measure in rooms or distance, but the kind that appears when your life is no longer filled with things you never questioned. For the first time in decades, there was nothing in front of me telling me who I needed to be next, and that was both unsettling and strangely freeing at the same time. I didn't leave for the wilderness the way people imagine. Not suddenly, not recklessly. I chose it. The place I found was at the edge of a pine forest, far enough from the city that the noise couldn't follow, but close enough that I wasn't pretending to disappear from the world entirely. A small town sat about 30 minutes away. There were roads, a general store, a place where people knew each other's names. I wasn't escaping life. I was stepping outside of the one I had built. The cabin itself was simple, wooden, quiet. Set back just enough that the trees felt like a wall between me and everything I had left behind. There was electricity, running water, but the signal was weak. Weak enough that the constant pull of the world finally loosened its grip. The first night, I didn't sleep. Not because of fear, but because of the silence. In the city, there is always something. A distant hum, a passing car, voices through walls. Here, there was nothing. I lay there in the dark, listening for a sound that never came, and slowly I began to understand something I hadn't expected. Silence is not empty. It has weight. It pressed against me in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost unbearable, because without noise, there was nothing left to distract me from my own thoughts. The next morning, I stepped outside. The air was colder than I was used to, cleaner too. It didn't carry urgency. It didn't ask anything from me. For a moment, I just stood there. No phone in my hand, no schedule waiting, no one expecting me to become anything more than what I already was. And that was when it hit me. For more than 60 years, my existence had been measured by movement, progress, decisions, outcomes. But here, none of that mattered. The trees didn't care what I had accomplished. The ground beneath my feet didn't recognize my name. And the wind, moving softly through the forest, carried no memory of who I used to be. At first, that felt like loss. But as the hours passed, something began to shift. Not outside, inside. I noticed how often my mind reached for something to do, something to fix, something to plan, and each time there was nothing there waiting for me. No urgency, no expectation, just space. It was unsettling, because I realized I didn't know how to exist without being needed. That afternoon, I walked deeper into the trees. Not far, just enough that the cabin disappeared behind me. For a moment, I stopped, completely still, and for the first time in decades, there was no one watching, no one listening, no one expecting anything from the man standing there, just the forest, and whatever was left of me inside it. That was the moment I understood something quietly, something that would take me much longer to fully accept. I had spent a lifetime becoming someone, but I had no idea how to simply be. The forest didn't ask me who I used to be. It asked something else, something simpler. What could I actually do now? On my second morning, I woke up with an ache that hadn't been there before. Not sharp, not alarming, just present. A quiet reminder that my body had its own memory of time. In the life I left behind, I had learned to ignore it. Long hours, late nights, decisions made without ever asking what it cost me physically. Out here, there was no ignoring anything. If I was cold, I felt it. If I was tired, there was no one to carry that weight for me. That day, I tried something simple. Gathering wood. It wasn't difficult, at least not in the way I remembered difficulty, but it was slow, slower than I expected. I bent down, picked up a piece, then another. After a few minutes, I stopped. Not because I wanted to, but because my body had already decided for me. I stood there, breathing heavier than I should have been, and for a brief moment, something unfamiliar surfaced. Frustration. Not at the task, at the realization. I was no longer the man who could move through the world without resistance. For years my mind had been enough. It made decisions, solved problems, moved everything forward. But here, my body set the pace, and it didn't negotiate. Later that afternoon, I walked a short distance uphill behind the cabin, the kind of path I wouldn't have thought twice about years ago. Halfway up, I had to stop, not dramatically, just long enough to catch my breath. I looked back down at the cabin below, still, quiet, waiting. And for the first time, I understood something in a way I never had before. Time doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. In meetings, in decisions, in years that feel productive until they suddenly feel distant. I stood there a little longer than necessary, not because I couldn't continue, but because I realized there was no reason to rush. That was new. Back in the world I left, everything had urgency. Every minute had a direction. Every action had a purpose. Here, there was only consequence. If I pushed too far, I would feel it. If I ignored what my body needed, there would be no one else to correct the mistake. That night, my hands ached slightly. My legs felt heavier. But there was something else, too. Something quieter. Clarity. For the first time in years, the discomfort I felt was honest, not the kind that came from pressure or expectation, not the kind that followed me through rooms and conversations. This was different. This was real. And, in a strange way, it felt cleaner, because out here, there was no confusion about where the pain came from, no illusion that I could outthink it, no story I could tell myself to make it disappear, just cause and effect. As I sat there in the fading light, hands resting quietly in my lap, I realized something I hadn't expected to find. For years, I had been surrounded by problems I could solve, but I had forgotten what it felt like to face something I simply had to live with. And for the first time in a very long while, that felt strangely honest. By the time the days began to feel familiar, something else started to change. Not outside, inside. The routines were simple now. Wake up, step outside, move slowly through the day. Nothing urgent, nothing waiting. At first, that kind of life felt like freedom, but freedom without direction can become something else entirely. Silence had already stripped away the noise. Now, it began to reveal what was underneath. I noticed it in small moments, when I sat too long without doing anything, when there was no task to distract me, when the day stretched out without asking anything in return. My mind didn't rest. It searched for something to fix, something to improve, something to become. And when it found nothing, it turned inward. That was when the discomfort changed. It was no longer physical. It was quieter than that, harder to explain. A question without words. Who are you? When there is nothing left to prove. I didn't have an answer. For most of my life, that question had never been necessary. I had roles, responsibilities, expectations that shaped me into someone the world could understand. But here, none of those things existed. There were no meetings to define my importance, no decisions to measure my value, no one watching to confirm that I mattered. Just me. And for a while, that felt like losing something. I remember one afternoon sitting outside the cabin. The air was still, no wind, no movement. I had nothing planned, nowhere to go, and for the first time in decades, I felt something I hadn't expected. Doubt. Not about the life I had left, but about the man who remained. Had I made a mistake? Had I walked away from something I would never rebuild? The thought stayed with me longer than I wanted it to, because it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't overwhelming. It was quiet. The kind of doubt that doesn't demand attention, but refuses to leave. I didn't push it away. I couldn't. There was nothing here to replace it with. So I sat with it. For minutes, then longer. And slowly, something began to shift. Not the doubt, but my response to it. I realized, for most of my life, I had never stayed long enough with any question to let it answer itself. There was always movement, always the next decision, the next solution, the next version of who I needed to be. But here, there was nowhere else to go. So I stayed, and in that stillness, something surfaced. Not clearly, not all at once, but enough. I saw it in fragments. In the way I had introduced myself for decades. In the way I measured time, success, worth. Everything had been built around becoming. Becoming better. Becoming more. Becoming someone who could not be ignored. And somewhere along the way, I had mistaken that for being. I had built a life that functioned perfectly, but I had never stopped long enough to meet the man living inside it. That realization didn't feel dramatic. It didn't break me. It didn't change everything at once. It simply stayed. And for the first time, I didn't try to turn it into something useful. I just let it be true. The days didn't suddenly become perfect. There was no moment where everything made sense. The forest didn't change me. It didn't offer answers. It didn't give me a new identity. What it did was remove everything that wasn't real. And in that space, something quieter began to take shape. I stopped measuring my days by what I accomplished, stopped asking what came next, stopped looking for something more, not because those things no longer existed, but because they were no longer necessary for me to feel complete. Some mornings, I still woke up early, out of habit, but instead of reaching for a schedule, I stepped outside. The air was different there, not better, just honest. It didn't rush me. It didn't expect anything. And for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to exist without being evaluated. There were still difficult days. Days when my body reminded me of its limits. Days when the silence felt heavier than I wanted it to. And sometimes, quietly, without warning, I would wonder what my life would look like if I had stayed. But the thought never lasted long, because I had already seen what that life required, and more importantly, what it had taken from me. I didn't regret what I had built. It gave me everything I thought I wanted, but it never gave me the one thing I didn't know I was missing. The ability to be still without feeling like I was falling behind. The ability to exist without becoming someone else. The ability to hear myself without the noise of everything I had created. That was something success had never taught me. Now there are no rooms waiting for me, no decisions that carry weight beyond the moment, no expectations that follow me into the night. Just time. Not the kind I used to measure, but the kind you can actually feel as it passes. Sometimes I sit outside the cabin long after the light begins to fade. The trees move gently in the wind. The air cools. The world continues, without needing anything from me, and for the first time in 86 years. That feels enough. If the noise around you disappeared tomorrow, if no one was watching, no one was waiting, no one was measuring, who would you be without it? I spent a lifetime becoming someone. And only now, at the very end of it, I am finally learning how to be. If one day, everything around you became quiet, no one waiting, nothing left to prove, who do you think you would be? If this story stayed with you, hold on to it for a quiet moment of your own. And maybe share it with someone who might be feeling the weight of too much noise.